Yeah.
Perfect.
I got onto the elevator, so I'm with you.
There you go. That's all. That's all that I need. See, I feel, I lived in Texas for a few years. We only moved back to Ireland recently, and I feel like the Irish gift of the gab gets me a long way. With
Well,
Americans. So
Texas was a hot spot for weightlifting, as a matter of fact, and
yeah,
powerlifting. The University of Texas had one of the strong men there. Oh, he passed away, unfortunately, of a heart attack. His wife is still there. Names are
that's.
not my forte. You'll have to do the research on the names.
Oh no, it's fine. That names aren't my forte. That's actually Jan and Terry Todd. So
Exactly.
I worked with Jan for 2 years. It's actually a close friend. Because historians interested in weightlifting, as you can imagine, it's
Yeah.
it's quite a small group of people.
Yeah.
But I'll tell Jan you're asking for her because her name, anyone I talk to, they're like, oh, you must be interested in. I'm like, yeah, close friend.
Very good. Please give her my regards.
Absolutely. So, like a very short and simple question to begin, because obviously you're an accomplished athlete in your own right, but I'm interested, your involvement with the IOC, how does that come about in the 1980s?
I was elected an IOC member in 1986. It was a surprise to everyone, including me. And I have served as a member of the IOC since that time. And over time, as I would make comments to President Salman, he finally said, okay, you're in charge of women and sport, and it's up to you to get more women included. And you can even nominate women from around the world if you think that there's a good IOC member out there. So he kind of gave me the keys to the kingdom. And so I started my work in getting women involved in each sport on the Olympic program, because why not? Aren't we equal? Yep, we're certainly equally human. And there's one race, the human race. We are all the same, and we are each unique. Even identical twins are not identical. But you and I are of the same race, the human race. So anyway, I have to get that out there. So the question was, why aren't there more women involved in the Olympic movement? And as time went on, I learned that for women, for men, they just want to have a position. Women need to be asked if they're willing to give their time to take a position. So in the area of sport, the weightlifting, I remember speaking with the former president, longtime president of weightlifting, whose name escapes me.
That's what Thomas Ian, was it?
Thomas Ian, of course, about why aren't there women? He said, but we do have women. And he showed me the nascent weightlifters. And I said, great, let's put it on the program. You have to apply. And so finally he did apply.
And for you, when you joined in '86, was that something that you had thought about your trajectory, or did someone sort of like shoulder tapped you and said, listen, we're trying to expand the Olympic program. We think you'd be.
Let me put it this way. When I was at the 76 games, when I actually got to compete, one of my teammates said to me, Anita, if we win a medal, the Lord will give it to us. And I said, oh, sure. Divine providence is always good. She said, no, you nitwit. Lord Callanan, the president of the IOC, will make the presentations. As long as we win one, I don't care, Anyway, so I didn't know what the IOC was.
And then, like, going into it in '86, did they just put, like, they said, the ball's in your court, we want to expand? Go?
No, what happened was I had stood up for the athletes and for the Olympic movement in 1980 against the boycott, when President Carter said that our team will not be going. I said, what do you mean we? Where was we when I was, shall we say, freezing a part of my anatomy off? last winter. What you mean we will not be going? And that was the point. The government had not one penny involved in the creation or sending or training of the U.S. Olympic team. So hands off. Leave us alone. We are private citizens doing this. And it just, I couldn't believe that the government was intervening in something that we private citizens had done for 100 years or more. And yet it happened.
It's an incredible thing. Like, so I actually teach my students about, the Soviet boycott and then the American boycott as well. It's, they sort of look at me like I'm making it up.
Well, as I say, there were a lot of people walking around without a spine, as far as I'm concerned.
So obviously, then when you're at the IOC in '86, I'm getting the impression you're not someone who's afraid of pushing for what you think is right or what you think should be happening.
I was curious about why things were the way they were. And I learned primarily things were the way they were because they'd always been that way. And I thought, okay, that doesn't mean they always have to be that way. So we have some room here to make some improvements.
And when it came to women's sport, like obviously, like sport is sport, but every sport has its own unique culture and its own unique problems and barriers. How difficult was it to traverse, like women's football has different barriers to getting legitimacy to, say, weightlifting or boxing, which comes in 2012. How does that happen at an IOC level?
Well, on the IOC level, we make policy, and our policy is that we should be 50-50, that every sport on the program should have women's events. Once we make that policy, it's up to the sports to figure out how to fulfill that policy. So we made a decision that all the sports on the program, and that wasn't until that finally happened at the London Games in 2012. 2012. First time every sport on the program had women's events.
And the idea of doing 50-50, was there a lot of pushback to that? Because from going through the special minutes, the fear of gigantism kept coming up, making the games too big.
Because we limited, leading into the Athens Games, there became a limit. Each sport was told how many athletes it could have. And it was up to the sport to figure out how to make that work. And then each game since then, there have been a little bit more of a squeeze to make room for the so-called new sports, which of course are sports that have been around, but just have not made it to games. What is new under the sun? I don't know. Maybe what's that stuff I'm off track, way off track. But the books, Harry Potter books, the
Quidditch,
fly around on brooms, one of those things.
I mean, give it a few decades, they'll probably be in the Olympics.
Exactly. I proposed that in a future. I did a future thing for the games of in Haiti in 44, I think. Anyway. So. Now I've completely forgotten where I was.
No, it's just in terms of buy-in to doing 50-50. The IOC, once this decision was taken.
Equality, not equity, but equality. Equity is maybe a tool you use to get to equality, but equality. And why not? Women and men are equally human, so we should be treated equally.
And so obviously, I mean, the IOC is an international organization, and I know women's sport in America has historically been held back, but by say the 80s and 90s, women's sport is a lot more accessible in the US versus other countries around the world. I'm just interested, how does the IOC negotiate like cultural relativism? Where some countries would say this isn't acceptable, and other countries would be more. You don't. Okay.
We don't. We work with the NOCs as best we can, but you need to have women on your team as well as men. holding the flag for opening ceremonies. Now we want both a man and a woman holding the flag. And that way we make sure stuff happens. And that's how we do it. There were a lot of countries that were allowing women to be the flag bearers. So this kind of was a step back to have a man and a woman. But for those countries that didn't have a woman before, now we had to make sure there was a woman and a man, which was good. So sometimes, you step back to move forward.
Which,
so anyway, you just do, you decide. I mean, that's the way the world is. In fact, there are a few more women than there are men of the 8 billion of us. As the World Health Organization announced today. And the Olympic movement should reflect the world, and does.
Mm-hmm. And when you're,
Excuse me.
Oh, sorry, blessing.
Sorry.
Okay, you good?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so.
My 10-month-old brought the flu into our house, so there's solidarity with that, with any sort of sneezing. So yeah, when you're, the chair of the sort of first IOC, the Women in Sport Commission, and you're working with different NOCs and you're working with different sports, I'm wondering, is there a privileging of certain sports first? Maybe more sports, so certain sports are, it's going to be an easier transition for them to bring women in. Like, did you work with the easier ones first and then go on to the hard ones? Or was it just, let's do a blanket and hit everyone at the same time?
Yeah, well, what's wrong with you guys that you have no women? I remember sometimes when I reached the National Olympic Committee, how come you have no women on national? Oh, we don't have any women. I said, that's odd. I would love to come to your country and see how you have no women in your entire country. And please explain this to me. Again, it's not easy because people have done things the way they've done them. But, if you give people a reason to do something that's better, they generally will. And slowly but surely, and as women now, every National Olympic Committee in the world has women Olympians. And that's important so that they can call upon the Olympians. You can't tell someone that Olympian knows nothing about sport. Each Olympian may not have the same understanding of sport as each other, but at least they are Olympians. And that's a start. And maybe that Olympian she has some friends who might be willing to do it if she doesn't have the time, as long as the meetings aren't at the dark end of an alley at 9:00 every Friday night. Adjustments have to be made to include half of the world in terms of when meetings are scheduled and so forth. So, yeah, it makes people change. It's the hardest thing humans do. It's true.
In so many different facets. And on that point of change, then, in terms of some of the not barriers, but some of the roadblocks that had to be dealt with, was it really just about getting like cultural buy-in? Because obviously at an NOC level, like, they have the facilities, they have coaches, they have some form of money.
Coaches not as much. And one of the things that happened in the U.S., which is very sad, once the positions for women coaches started being paid, there were fewer women who were in the coaching positions because the guys gave their buddies the jobs instead of the women who had been laboring all these years in the positions didn't get the jobs, which was really unfair. Internationally, we don't have enough women coaches, and that's probably the hardest barrier to get into and propagate. We can get into presidents of federations, we can get into executive boards, athlete reps, we can do, number of athletes on the playing field, we can manage all of that. But coaches is really the toughest one because a coach gives up so much of one's life to do that. And asking women to do that with, again, unfortunately, not necessarily the warmest feeling from colleagues, is really, really tough and lonely. Although there are more and more women's coaches groups getting together to support one another, which is a useful thing to do.
And so interestingly, I was speaking to someone from the IWF, it was only 2 days ago, and he was saying the same thing, that for them it's so strange that they have, record numbers of female athletes, they have more women coming into the administrative level. But he said coaching is just this weird blind spot that they can't get people in. So one of the problems that they see it is that, at a certain level, the coaching is all voluntary and it's not being paid. And depending on the country, it would tend to be the men would do the volunteer role and spouses would then, mind children, manage the household, etc. And the same support isn't given if, say, the woman wants to be, volunteering 2 or 3 nights a week. And
we're getting a little better with our military, because sometimes the woman is the one who's stationed and the guy stays with the family. So, it's something that's different. And again, change is what humans resist the most, but we're going to get there. We're going to get there.
And when you're, some of the papers that you put forward in the early 90s, I had the privilege of being able to go through them. And it was interesting because it seemed like from very early on, you realized that it wasn't just about getting athletes in, it was about getting coaches and administrators and referees and medic. Like it was very modern and progressive to see you saying, so early in the 90s, we actually need equality at every level, because if we just have an athlete level, that sort of fades away fairly quickly. Was that a general consensus, or?
Well, we needed to change the picture, and I knew my work wasn't done until we changed the picture. And some of it was changing as the athletes lined up to come in and compete. That changed, but not enough in the coaching, for sure. And also, journalism has gotten better. It's better. And journalism at the games, for sure, the coverage is absolutely proportionate to the men and women on the team for each NOC. It's amazing how it works during the games. But after the games, suddenly there are no women athletes in this country of ours. None. Zero. Because you can't see them on the front pages. USA Today is supposed to be the journal of record for the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. And there's usually a woman somewhere mentioned in the sports section, but it's not enough. Not enough.
And do you think, like, just looking at the United States, so obviously, Title IX does so much to open up at least opportunities, maybe not bringing equality to the way sometimes it's described as, but at least opening up opportunities. Was there a sense?
Well, that Title IX was created for professors.
Yeah.
The word sport was said once in the entire history of the act. One time the word sport. So it was really for professors, and my mom was one of those professors who had hope that it would help her get promoted. So that's why I knew the real purpose of Title IX, and I'm delighted that those clever attorneys figured out that it said any program receiving federal funding needed to be equal, and therefore sports, and therefore opportunity for girls and women.
And do you think, because sometimes when I'm trying to think of how to phrase this properly, but some of the newspapers and magazines from the US that I would have read in the 80s and 90s, from the 80s and 90s, it was almost like they said, like, we have Title IX, we had Title IX, we had our revolution, nothing else needs to be done. Like, was there a complacency at times in the US? Because some people could say we did, even though they didn't, but we did it, so to speak.
Not so much complacency as it was the football guys in particular who wanted really nothing to do, and it was the NC2A. It wasn't until maybe the 90s that the women's rowing championship was finally put into place. The NC2A was pretending for way too long. and they really didn't have national championships. And until you start the rise of the national championships is when the NC2A got serious about women's sports. But look what they did last year to the women's basketball team. Put them at like a kindergarten with little bitty Legos as weights. I mean, it was ridiculous. So they're willing to do it. If they're willing to do it last year, we still haven't come the distance we need to come.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that until you mentioned it, and then it just horrifically popped back into my head, which is the most insulting.
Oh, incredible.
Yes.
Just like the men, these women have honed their skills, and they'll go on maybe to be professional, maybe not, since there are only 7,000 men and women who make a living in all sports in the U.S. 7,000, all sports, men and women, period. Maybe not, but just as the men, maybe not, the women deserve the best for the national championship.
And instead, they got itty bitty dumbbells and like pretty much the broom closet. And actually, on that, then, because you are so uniquely placed to talk about it as an athlete and then an administrator as well, in terms of, say, the expectations of female athletes from, say, your own time being an Olympian to then overseeing this huge influx, because it really is this like incredible, the dam sort of bursts in the 90s in terms of the Olympics bringing in more and more, games for women. In terms of the expectation then of female athletes, do you think like there's been a sort of cultural shift? Because to finish my very long question, it's interesting. Speaking to lifters from the 70s, it was all about needing to prove themselves. Speaking to lifters from the 80s, 90s, it was, I enjoy my sport and I want to be the best athlete I can be. There seems to be a period where they lost the need to prove that they deserve to be in the sport, and then they could just be an athlete.
Yeah, that's very interesting because in rowing, we didn't have that. We just knew we were going to be selected to be either the national team for the U.S. that year or then the Olympic team. So others had proved that we were up to it, I guess, in many respects. And it was quite unusual. And I will say that Monique Berliou had a lot to do with the fact that when women's rowing came on the program, we had 6 events. Usually a women's event started with 1 or 2 events, but we started with all 6 because that's what Monique Berliou said was the outcome of the vote. And then I realized, as I was a vice president for a number of years, I said, wait a minute. We have exactly the same number of events that we had when I started. That's ridiculous. We should have 7 and 7. And that's what we finally have now. The men had 8 events, and the women had 6. Easy. Just switch one men's event to one, and you got 7 and 7. You got 14 medals. And so finally, that's what international rowing did. Oh, everybody was mad about it, but they're over it now.
And it is interesting because I looked, say, not only at weightlifting, but, other sports. And when there was a talk of, we'll reduce the men's categories by 1 or by 2, to create that, 4 and 4, or 6 and 6, 7 and 7. Like the number of male administrators who say, I have no problem with women's boxing, women's weightlifting, women's rowing, women's tennis, women's football, but we couldn't possibly take one division from the men's. Was that the biggest sticking point? It was the sense of, yes, but you can't take away.
Of course. Always, again, we're back to change, and this involves change, and it's always hard to change. And whose gourd who gets gourd, or whatever the colloquialism is, whose ox gets gourd, I guess is what it is a question for those who know the sport best, and maybe you never really needed that extra person, but it was a giveaway to someone who'd been a loyal soldier And now the loyal soldier gets to watch like everyone else on TV. Or, you get tickets with the loyal soldier so that they can attend the games really for fun.
And moving, I suppose, more substantially then, because I know you have an involvement in sort of both American Olympics, because obviously you work, at the LA84 and then the LA84 Foundation, which, sort of sidebar, as a historian, is the most wonderful, like the amount of money and resources for the LA84 Foundation has helped literally thousands of, sports students, historians, sport management, business majors, etc.
Makes me happy to hear that. Yes.
That's been like when I was teaching in Texas, to say I relied on it heavily is an understatement. But then also the Atlanta Games in '96, reading the submissions for inclusion. So obviously, like women's football is probably, I know there's a number of women's sports that come, but I think women's football is one of the more high profile ones.
And
It seemed like
and
women's softball, yeah. It seemed like there was a sort of like rush to get, there's almost like a number of different women's sports
here's
all
the
vying
thing.
for Atlanta.
The rule for the IOC is you don't put a sport on the program less than 7 years, because that gives the National Olympic Committee and the Federation time for the athletes to be prepared. You can put an event on within 4 years. So since the sport of football, as you call it, was already on the program,
soccer.
Yeah, soccer. Okay, soccer. Women's soccer was not a new sport. It was a new event. So within 4 years and maybe 3 years, you could put that on. And since there was this kind of pretend that baseball and softball were men and women, because baseball was on the program, softball then became the women's event of baseball. So that's, it kind of slid in there. But golf did not, because golf was completely unto its own and could not be put on the program with less than 7 years.
Yeah, and it's funny reading reading letters from the mayor at the time, to the president of the IOC.
Yeah.
Very much pushing the golf angle. And so, Augusta and all these things.
Was also very restricted.
And was there, because it's funny because obviously the IOC is so clear on, the process of going from your application to, if accepted, to the games themselves. Within the sports, there was a huge amount of confusion. So say within weightlifting, even though the IWF knew from '91 that the first chance they'd have is 2000, there seemed to be a huge amount of confusion among athletes and even administrators around, when it would come.
If the president had been, shall we say, a little bit better at going to meetings and paying attention and so forth. It wasn't confusion. You got a number of athletes, and those athletes had to be divided up, men and women, so that you would have a competition worthy of the Olympic Games. And the confusion might have been, to say nothing of weightlifting, but perhaps about what teams were in or out of crisis with doping, and how many of them could possibly be ready. I mean, your sport has pretty much a really bad reputation for doping. I'm saying it's your sport.
No, but it's not
but it's just got to clean itself up, or it will be gone, because the bus is full, and somebody can get off the bus so somebody can get back on. So look out.
And it's interesting on that. Like, I'm not sure how much you want to say, but obviously, like, doping in weightlifting is, like, it's been a problem since the 70s. And, so all of the correspondence I have from Thomas Ian to Samarant, talking about doping from for quite a long time in both men's tenure. Like, it seemed at an IOC level that weightlifting had sort of perennial problems every games, every cycle, and changes were obviously made, but it seems that as a sport, it really has a very problematic um, status
They're
within the IC.
cheaters.
Yeah,
That's the problem. They're cheaters. Let's face it. I don't know how they can look themselves in the mirror. They'll never know how good they really were. And that's what I feel sorry about the rowers who have the Soviet rowers and the East German, two countries that no longer exist. We say they had different jelly beans than we had. And yeah, they had jelly beans that helped them train much harder and recover much faster so they could train much harder than we ever could. We kind of knew it. We didn't make any allegations, but when it all came down, it was all proven to be true. And similarly, in the sport of weightlifting, and with all the gyms around and with all the concoctions around, somebody's always trying to get an edge. Well, work harder.
And by the time, so like there was a time when weightlifting held a huge amount of status, just in terms of the popularity in the Olympics. So I'm thinking of is the Soviets versus the US. Vasily Alexiev and
who went by and by and by.
Yeah.
Took a while for him to pass by.
Quite a lot. I mean, to be fair, if you have an athlete like that, you're just going to hang on to him, with a very tight grip.
Sure.
By the 80s and 90s, like I think globally, weightlifting's popularity has decreased. And, like they would talk about that, internally and externally. Is it a heavy hitter? Because it is interesting, when women's soccer comes to the Olympics in '96, it's on the sort of crest of, popularity in women's soccer in America more generally. Likewise, softball, actually, the numbers have increased quite a good deal in the 1990s. It's interesting, within weightlifting, they seemed quite confident internally that they were coming to Atlanta in '96 because it was growing, but they also seem quite ignorant of A, weightlifting status, in a global context, and then B, like the 2 or 3 giant sports for women, that were also vying for spots. Is that like an accurate representation?
Well, they didn't care about women's weightlifting, would be an accurate representation.
Yeah.
They were doing what they had to do, and they didn't really care. And I tell you, we had a workout. We call it the West German workout. And our goal was to move 54 tons in 45 minutes. So now we weren't doing it, like that.
Like weight is weight, so
a lot of weight, but so lots of sport use weightlifting as part of training is my only point, and we certainly did in rowing. But being focused on getting a specific weight up over your head without, falling on top of your head is something completely different. And the skill and technique it takes, I admire, but you got to get the doping under control. Because it just makes it impossible for clean athletes to think they'll ever have a fair chance.
I think it's interesting. Part of this study has been looking at just the general public's perceptions of weightlifting, because obviously, every 4 years the world will lock in on the 100-meter sprint and see, is a record going to be broken, or the butterfly, or there'll be certain sports that people lock into every cycle, and weightlifting drops out of the conversation sort of from the mid 1970s, early 80s, because doping has just become so prevalent that people don't have faith in
we don't
the
care
records.
Who the strongest person is.
Yeah, because they'll have a gold medal pulled almost immediately. And I think it's interesting. There's a very brief moment in 2000 when the first women's weightlifting team goes to Sydney in the US, because the US women's team don't have the sort of tarnish of doping attached to them, because
our doctors weren't ethically couldn't do it, and so forth.
And there was there was a smaller life cycle in the sport, etc. But then the first American lifter to win a gold medal, actually the first woman to win a gold medal at the Olympics is Tara Knott, pardon me, who wins because, initially she finishes second and the athlete who finished first
Yeah, it was terrible. We weren't sure we were going to be able to present any medals because it was so deep in one of the events in wrestling. Unfortunately,
it's incredible that the sort of maiden outing at the Sydney, at the Olympics in 2000 in Sydney, that doping rears its head, and I'm just like, from your perspective, who's done so much to get women's games, into the Olympics, like when you see stuff like that, is it just sort of like throwing your hands up in the air and
who are
saying,
the
come on?
administrators? Who are the people in charge? There's still guys. And we need to get more women in there to ask the tough questions, because the guys are not going to ask each other the tough questions, evidently. So we need some people in there who will do that, who will be naive enough to be able to really ask the questions that need to be asked.
And with that, and it's something that I actually probably should have asked a wee bit earlier, but it's just dawned on me now. In terms of, so when the IOC says to the NOCs, we need more, or not more, but we need equality and we need opportunities and accessibility for women in this sport. Did athlete safeguarding come in to that conversation? Because in weightlifting, some of the stories I've heard are, especially from the 80s, are just like harrowing in terms of the negligence.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't know. Well, maybe I'm not sorry, I don't know more about that. But safe sport is unfortunately worldwide a newer idea. I've been working with children in sport and the children's rights before that when I was an attorney. So I know of all the issues there are with pedophiles and grooming and so forth and so on in the sport. And it's been, we told our coaches at the foundation that you are never to be alone with an athlete, ever. A coach may never be alone with an athlete. That just, it may be your child, but you're not supposed to be alone with an athlete if you're a coach. And that's really the only way you can prevent it. Come close to preventing the grooming and stuff that goes on. We hope for the best. They do background checks, but Safe Sport has got an impossible job. They have so many people calling in with complaints, and they all have to be followed up, and some outcome has to be reached, and they do all this without the power of a police force of any kind. So it's all people cooperating for the good of sport. So it's not a perfect world yet, but at least we get some names up on the board for those coaches who should never be allowed to work with children. And in your sport, I don't know who they are, but I hope they're being named and gotten out of the sport.
Yeah, and it's even at an adult level, initially say, female, because weightlifting, there's, strict weight divisions. There are a number of women who've said that, when there was two women in a competition, they would have to weigh in front of the men and they'd be asked to strip down naked in front of the men, just like.
That's just stupid. They don't need to do that. There could be a woman at the weight. If that's what they have to do, I don't know. In rowing, you have to have your singlet on, so at least you have to be covered somewhat, the men and the women. So I don't know what the rules are in weightlifting, but if it was down to the zero, there should be a woman there at the weight.
And this is really, to the reports that you would have written in the 90s in particular, this was a case of when you don't have women at every level of the sport.
Well, you know what you need, plan for it.
And I think that's something that, the sort of first generation of lifters who would have come through, being the only woman in the room, a lot of them, like, they're made from tougher stuff than I am, admittedly, where they just sort of like shrug their shoulders, and I'm like, oh my God. But it is that thing of, there was a novelty, there wasn't that support network. So
They
it was it.
wanted to do something really difficult.
Yeah, pretty much. Some people like to climb the mountain because it's there.
Yeah, well, and they did, and they opened the door for women to come. So thank you, thank them for me.
Absolutely. And so one of the I wouldn't say issue per se, but one of the problems historically in, say, Olympic weightlifting has been that the people in power have traditionally been white men, and there's always been an undertone of racism within the sport. And it could be in the 1950s, Black and African American athletes were depicted in cartoons the way you'd imagine racist depictions of Black or African American athletes would be.
Let me remind you, there was one race, the human race. We were all the same, and yet we're each unique. We come, even identical twins are not identical. We come in different skin colors, but we're humans, all of us. We're one species, the human species. So if we could get people to understand that, skin color is just how you describe someone, and that's really all it should be. And this notion of some noble this or noble that is just nonsense. That's why we have the Olympic Games, to see who the best athletes really are, and they come in all sizes, shapes, and colors. You have a short sprinter or a really tall swimmer. It just happens.
Yeah, and so I suppose one of the things I think the Olympics has done very well is, as you said, the really pushing of, the bigger, faster, stronger, and then obviously they've added like solidarity to that, which really is
together.
Together. Oh, sorry, together. My French is absolutely terrible. Together. So I think that's been such an interesting, I suppose, mantra for the last 100 years, and it's looking at, in the US, there's been a huge conversation around pushing that togetherness, especially in the last, say, 5 or 6 years within the weightlifting space. Now, admittedly, things had to happen to push that, but I'm wondering, like, when it comes to those programs for, getting more women into sport in the 90s and even in the early 2000s, was there a conversation around the sort of the different barriers that women from different backgrounds, be it race or be it social class or economic class, that they faced?
We had seminars where the participants came from all sorts of backgrounds, and some of them were very reluctant to even raise their hands. But I did my best that by the end of the seminar, everybody would have contributed and felt like they had a friend that they could call on in the future to get things going. Now, of course, that's me being all rosy and things are perfect and things will be good. And it didn't always work out that way, but that was the idea, so that people wouldn't be alone and they would know that there were others similarly situated doing something new and different and helping the world through sport.
And as we start to wind down, because I'm conscious that you're probably very, very busy, and I don't want to overstep that mark. I have two questions, both small, I do promise. So the first is just thinking about, as an athlete, as an administrator, something that's sort of line through the research is representation. And what I mean by that is when Karen Marshall, who's a brilliant weightlifter from the 1970s, when she got into weightlifting, her coach had to tell her about Katie Sandrina, who was a weightlifter from the 1880s. That there was this sort of historical gap. And then in the 2000s, Cheryl Hayworth goes to the Sydney Games and she can look at Robin Bird, who's been lifting since the 80s. Like, she had that representation. And as someone who pushed for women's sport, like, what does that representation mean, sort of at a practical level, that women can point at? I want to be a softball player. Oh, I can look at the last Olympic cycle and see, how the US team has done.
Well, you can look historically, and that's the important thing. And that was kind of kind of my part of my play when I was getting people to think about equality. You look back on urns, you see women kicking balls, or with, in battle like this, you see them boxing. So how could you say women don't do this? It's been over the eons and the century, women have. Maybe not in the way we see it right now, but that's because there have been blockades made. So take down those barriers and you will see women taking part in these sports as we know them now, as these modern sports. And that's kind of the argument that I made, and I guess successfully made, to get every sport on the program with women's events.
Right. And then the very last question, I do promise this, and feel free, pardon me, to be as blunt as possible. What question should I have asked you? So, because everyone has their own expectation, and everyone has their own interpretation. So what question are you like, man, this Irish guy was nice, at least I hope I came across nice, but he really missed out on the important question?
I don't think so. I don't know enough about weightlifting to go into great depth. Some of the names you've named I recognize, so that's good. But in general, change is hard, and humans hate change. And the one thing that you've already done the only advice I give people, and that is ask for help. And you've asked me for help in understanding what has gone on in the past, and I hope I've been able to help you.
No, this has been really wonderful. Like, as I said, your name is obviously, as you well know, littered throughout any conversation at the IOC about bringing women in sport. So no, I really appreciate your time with this. So I will be in touch with the manuscript, and you can say you've completely misrepresented me. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, I do appreciate this. So thank you very much.
Pleasure. Good luck with your studies.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.